There were mornings when Raymond Carter swore he was still the man he used to be. All it took was a quick glance at his reflection in the bus window, right before the vehicle rattled and warped everything, and for a second he could see that 20-something kid who believed hard work fixed everything. But the glass always shook, and so did life. And once both settled, what returned was the tired face of a man who had given far more than he ever received. On that gray Thursday, he arrived at the warehouse too early, even by his own standards. The sun wasn't up yet, the industrial lights flickered with an irritating buzz, and the silence carried a strange weight, a kind that doesn't suggest rest, but neglect. It was there, in that cold corridor, that he felt the first sting of what was coming. It hadn't been just a life of hard work. It had been a life of postponing things. He'd spend years promising himself that later he'd do something better. Later he'd push for a promotion. Later he'd demand respect. Later he'd actually live. But Raymond's later had turned into a dusty warehouse, and no one cleans out a warehouse alone. He was loading boxes onto the cart when he heard quick footsteps behind him. The new manager, too young, too self-assured, and far too fascinated with his own reflection, was walking in with a group of employees. Their low chuckles already signaled what Raymond had learned to recognize: someone approaching, eager to medicate their own insecurity by humiliating somebody else. "Carter," the manager called, loud enough for everyone to hear, "you're always the first one here and somehow still slow. Guess showing up early doesn't make up for your age, huh?" The laughter came instantly, not loud but sharp, the kind that doesn't bruise the body, just your dignity. Raymond kept holding the box, took a slow breath, and didn't respond. Not because he was submissive, but because he knew any reaction would be used against him. He only wished for a brief moment that the box were heavy enough to justify the tremor in his hands. When the group walked away, the silence returned. But now it felt different, thicker, more personal. Raymond rested the box on the cart and stood there, staring at the floor. What he felt wasn't anger. It was worse. It was the realization that he had allowed all of this to happen for years, that the manager was only pointing out a truth he already knew. Raymond had become invisible, and nobody respects what they don't see. But something shifted in that moment, a thought that didn't arrive with rage but with clarity, a surgical kind of clarity. If I keep living like this, I'm going to die like this. It was a truth too harsh to ignore. He finished his shift in silence. On the bus ride home, he looked at his hands, calloused, strong, still useful, and wondered when he'd accepted the idea that he was too old to change. At home, he found the small photo of his daughter tucked inside his wallet, and something caught him off guard. He was living a life she would never admire, not because she lacked love, but because he had stopped admiring himself. That night, Raymond didn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, that sentence echoed, "If I keep living like this, I'm going to die like this." At 4 in the morning, he got up, not out of obligation, but out of choice, and for the first time in many years, he decided to arrive early for a different reason, not to impress anyone, not to look hardworking, not to avoid criticism. He wanted to show up early for himself. He put on his old jacket, breathed in the cold dawn air, and walked towards the warehouse with steady steps, the steps of someone who didn't yet know where he was heading, but had finally stopped running from what he needed to confront. When he opened the door to the empty building, he felt that heavy silence again, but this time it didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like a beginning. And the question that had been hammering in his mind since the day before returned with a different tone, now less desperate but more challenging. What if there's something in me I haven't tapped into? Raymond gave a faint smile. Maybe late, maybe unlikely, but for the first time in a long time, genuine. The problem is that every change comes at a cost, and he would soon find out that starting early isn't enough, especially when the world has already decided what role you're supposed to play. Still, he started anyway. And in that freezing warehouse, before sunrise, the man who would let his life slip through his fingers finally closed his hands around it. Because deep down, the real question wasn't whether he still had strength. The question was, how long could he keep pretending he didn't?
Raymond had never noticed how different the warehouse looked in the dark. Without the forklifts rumbling, without the hurried footsteps of coworkers, without the shouted orders from someone who needed to hear his own voice to feel important, the place felt bigger, emptier, and strangely honest. He grabbed a broom, not because it was part of his job, but because he needed to start somewhere. The cold, worn floor was the same one he'd walked on for 19 years. 19 years that, from a distance, looked like a stack of identical days piled on top of each other. But in that silence, something in him understood that the repetition was reaching its breaking point. As he swept, he heard the metal door creak. Someone was arriving way too early, earlier than he ever expected to see another human silhouette. It was Lucas, a skinny kid, young, with the tired eyes of someone who sleeps poorly, probably more from uncertainty than from exhaustion. He stopped in the doorway and frowned at the scene. "Mr. Carter, everything okay?" he asked. Raymond realized how odd that sounded. Mr. Carter. That kind of respect only appeared when someone actually looked at him, and that didn't happen often. "Today, yeah," Raymond answered, not joking, but honest. Lucas hesitated. He looked at the broom, at the floor, then back at him. And then he said something Raymond didn't expect to hear, not before 7 in the morning, not ever, really. "I saw, yesterday, the way the manager talked to you. It was wrong." Raymond paused for a second. No one ever said that. People saw but pretended they didn't. It was safer that way. "It happens," Raymond replied, but there was a tiredness beneath his voice that made the truth impossible to hide. Lucas took a breath as if gathering courage. "I didn't want to stand there laughing. It's just, you know how it is, right? Sometimes if you don't laugh, you're the next one." Raymond looked at him for a moment that felt longer than it was, because standing in front of him was an unexpected mirror, a young man already afraid of becoming him one day, a young man who already sensed the danger of living with his head down, believing it would protect him. "I know," Raymond said with a heavy calm. "I lived like that for too long." Lucas nodded, understanding more than he spoke. "If you need anything, I'm around," he added. Then he left, leaving behind a different kind of echo in the air. It wasn't sympathy. It wasn't pity. It was a quiet warning that someone actually saw him. Raymond went back to work, and as the warehouse gradually filled with people, he noticed something else. Yesterday's humiliation had cast a kind of shadow over him. They didn't talk, but they watched. It was as if everyone was waiting for him to snap or quit, as if men his age were always predictable when pushed too far. But he wasn't there to prove anything to them. The world around him simply didn't believe that. When the manager finally showed up, with his strong cologne and his comically tight shirt, he found a different Raymond. Not aggressive, not rebellious, just present. It's incredible how someone changes when they stop asking permission to exist. The manager noticed. "Carter," he said, scratching his chin, trying to sound casual, "I heard you showed up before everyone else again?" "And?" Raymond said, "Just looking at him. And I hope it's not because you're trying to impress someone. That's all. I'm not trying to impress anyone. I'm just working." The manager gave a short smile, the kind of people give when they realize they've lost a piece of control, but he walked away without pushing further. Raymond spent the rest of the shift feeling something unusual inside him. It wasn't courage, it wasn't pride. It was an internal boundary finally being built, like a fence that had been knocked down for years, suddenly standing upright again. And he knew changes like that have a domino effect, first inside, then outside. During lunch, he sat alone, as he always did. But this time, he sat alone by choice, not exclusion. While eating the poorly made sandwich he'd thrown together that morning, he watched the younger workers talk about courses, opportunities, plans. Other people's lives always seemed more in motion when your own had been still for too long. He felt a tightness in his chest. Not envy, regret. How many things could he have tried? How many doors had he never pushed open because he thought he didn't have the right? How many times did he confuse loyalty with settling? That's when the question returned. The one born the day before, now even sharper. And what if I can still reinvent myself? It wasn't an optimistic question. It was uncomfortable, frightening. Because reinventing yourself at 50 isn't poetry. It's a fight against your own history. But the afternoon came to an end, and Raymond walked away with something he hadn't had in years. A beginning. Small, invisible to anyone looking from the outside, but deep enough to shift the path of a future he still didn't have the courage to imagine. That day, he didn't go home defeated, or drained, or numb like so many times before. He went home alert, because the world didn't warn him it was going to change. But it did. And for the first time, Raymond realized he could change with it.
The next few days looked the same on the surface, but Raymond felt something different moving inside him. A thin, almost invisible thread of discipline, like a dormant muscle finally waking up after decades of neglect. It felt strange, uncomfortable, even a little absurd, but quietly, it was working. He started arriving before dawn, always. Not out of obligation, out of ritual. The dark warehouse had become a kind of private territory, a place where no one interrupted him, where no one demanded anything, where the world hadn't yet woken up to remind him who he was supposed to be. And in that pocket of calm, he began to straighten out the chaos he had never had the time or the courage to see. Misaligned shelves, outdated inventory lists, poorly documented processes, equipment no one had inspected in months. Tiny, overlooked details, ignored mostly because everyone was too busy trying to survive the grind of each shift. Raymond started small. He reorganized the safety area. Then he reviewed the transit logs. One especially quiet morning, he found an old discrepancy. Not disastrous, but enough to create small domino errors. He fixed everything, relabeled items, updated spreadsheets. He didn't tell a soul. He didn't need to. By the following week, the sector was running smoother. People noticed. They just didn't know who to thank. And for the first time, he didn't feel the urge to raise his hand and say, "That was me." It was as if fixing the warehouse had fixed a part of him, too. But discipline isn't only about building. It's about facing things. And the world never takes long to test someone trying to change. On a particularly muggy Tuesday, he was called into the manager's office. The half-open door leaked the man's voice, impatient, as always. When Raymond stepped in, the manager didn't bother looking away from his monitor. "I'm seeing here that you've been changing some things in the inventory process. Did someone authorize that?" Raymond stood still. It wasn't fear, it was the old version of himself trying to grab the wheel.
"No," he said calmly. "I saw errors piling up and decided to fix them." The manager leaned back, caught between irritation and insecurity. "You can't just change the system. There's a chain of command. There are protocols." "And there were errors no one touched for months. I only did what needed to be done." The manager narrowed his eyes. It wasn't courage that bothered him. It was independence. "Look, Carter, I don't want people getting the wrong idea. The team needs to know who's in charge." Raymond recognized the trap. If he backed down, he'd go right back to being invisible. If he pushed too hard, he'd become a target. So he chose the most honest middle ground he could find. "I know who's in charge, but knowing who leads doesn't mean ignoring what's right." The manager didn't respond right away. There was no script for dealing with someone who didn't beg for approval, but also didn't declare war. "You can go," he said, finally, curt. Raymond didn't lose his composure. He walked out knowing he had crossed an internal line he'd never managed to cross before, the line between obedience and backbone. The weeks rolled on. He slipped up sometimes, missed a prep shift, overslept, lost focus in the middle of the afternoon. But unlike before, he didn't turn failures into self-punishment. Instead of spending the day beating himself up, he simply started again. And that habit of starting again began to get attention. Older co-workers watched him with cautious curiosity. The younger ones saw him as a mix of reference and mystery. Even Lucas, quiet, observant, started asking for tips, how he organized things, how he kept that routine. Raymond didn't have polished answers. He just said, start small, but start every day. And somehow, that was more useful than any corporate manual. But nothing changes without resistance. And resistance showed up on a cold morning when the refrigeration system failed. It was a quiet disaster. Perishable goods at risk. Operations stalled. Supervisors running in circles. Workers calling for help as if someone there had a magic solution. The manager, clearly lost, tried barking random orders. The truth was simple. No one had the experience to coordinate that level of chaos. No one, except the man who had spent months studying, reviewing, organizing, and disciplining himself before dawn. Raymond watched the commotion and felt a sharp clarity. This was the moment he wanted but never admitted, the moment he feared more than he confessed. "Carter!" the manager shouted, desperate. "Do something!" Raymond didn't run, he didn't yell, he didn't wave his arms around, and he didn't try to look like anyone's hero. He simply breathed, as he had practiced every morning, and stepped into the leadership no one else dared to take. First, shut down Sector 3. Now. You check the intake line. You verify critical stock. And call the technician before this turns into a 5-figure loss. The team followed without hesitation. It wasn't forced authority. It was earned trust. As he oversaw each step, Raymond felt something unfamiliar. Not fear, but competence. Not adrenaline, but purpose. All the quiet discipline of the past months was right there in his body, acting with a naturalness that looked like experience, but was really just consistency. In 30 minutes, chaos became order. In 40, the system was under control. In an hour, the loss had been avoided. And when everything ended, no one had to say the shift was his. The silence of the team said everything. And as the manager tried to regain his posture in front of the executives arriving to assess the crisis, Raymond realized something he had never understood so clearly. The discipline he'd built didn't change the job. It changed the man doing the job. And that, more than any praise, was the real victory.
When the board finished reviewing the report about the crisis that had almost blown up, something shifted in the way people looked at Raymond. It wasn't flattery, and it wasn't surprise. It was recognition. The whole room felt charged with a curious silence, as if everyone were rediscovering the man they had spent years deliberately overlooking. The manager tried to lead the conversation, but his voice came out shaky. "Well, fortunately, we managed to get everything under control in time." He swallowed hard. "The team worked together to—" "The real leadership came from Carter," the director cut in. "No ceremony, no room for interpretation." The manager kept a tight smile, but it looked like he was swallowing glass on the inside. "Yes, of course," he replied, straightening up. "Carter contributed a lot." Raymond stayed standing, discreet, not trying to put himself in the spotlight. He didn't need to. He wasn't there to collect medals. The director stepped closer. "Good work," she said, offering her hand. He shook it firmly, but without a hint of self-importance. "I just did what needed to be done." "Most people don't," she answered. "That's why many become replaceable, and some indispensable." The sentence hit him harder than he expected, not because it was praise, but because of the contrast with that other line, the one that had cut him weeks earlier. "You're easily replaceable." It was as if the world were finally returning the corrected version of that sentence. But when the shift ended and everyone headed home, Raymond realized the most important moment of that day had nothing to do with external approval. It happened in the car alone, with the engine off, staring at his reflection in the rearview mirror. It was strange. He recognized himself, yet at the same time he seemed to be looking at a stranger, someone more grounded, more awake, more aware. That reflection made him understand something he had never admitted, not even to himself. Life doesn't change when the world finally recognizes you. Life changes when you finally recognize yourself. That night, the kitchen looked different, even though nothing had changed. The same small table, the same reheated coffee in the same mug, the old fridge with a faded Route 66 magnet. But Raymond wasn't running on autopilot anymore. That silence, the same one that used to feel uncomfortable, now felt like fertile ground. It was in that silence that he could think clearly. It was there that he could see everything he had ignored for decades. He opened an old notebook he'd found in a forgotten drawer. Yellowed pages, most of them blank. He'd decided that would be the place where he'd record what he was building. Not big goals, not childish dreams, but habits. Small gears that, when turned every single day, create permanent change. He wrote, "Tomorrow, repeat. Even if it hurts, even without inspiration, repeat." It was simple, almost crude, but deeply true. Because discipline isn't built on enthusiasm. It's built on quiet persistence. The months went by the way they do for people who work hard. Not fast, not slow, steady. Raymond stuck to his routine, stumbling and getting back up over and over again. There were mornings when the alarm went off and he wanted to quit everything. There were nights when his body begged him to sleep earlier. There were weeks when it felt like nothing was changing, no matter how hard he tried. But something in him now refused to return to the old pattern, because every step, no matter how small, was a way of rebuilding himself. Coworkers started asking him for advice, not technical advice, but life advice. Lucas was the first to admit it. "Carter, I don't know how you do it. I can't stick to anything for more than a week." Raymond shrugged, honest. "I couldn't either. The difference isn't strength. It's choosing again every day." Lucas looked at him like someone who had just heard a truth that was uncomfortable and necessary.
Raymond realized that without trying, he had become something he once looked for. Not a hero, not a boss, not a savior, but a possible example. One afternoon, the manager called him in again. His tone was different, less arrogant, less defensive. "Carter," he began hesitant, "about that day, when I said you were replaceable." Raymond raised his hand, calm. "You don't need to explain." "I do," the manager insisted. "I was wrong, and you proved that." Raymond didn't smile. He didn't look for revenge. He didn't savor the moment. "I didn't change because of you," he said, not harshly, but with steady clarity. "I changed for myself." The manager nodded, uneasy, not out of shame, but out of genuine respect. And there it was, the invisible closure of that cycle. The humiliation that once broke him was no longer a wound. It was foundation. Raymond walked through the warehouse with an easy stride. He was no longer the man bent under the weight of endless tasks, nor the one who tried to make himself small just to fit into spaces that weren't meant for him. He was whole. He kept his rituals, helped whoever needed it, guided without forcing, observed without judging, and most importantly, he repeated, always repeated, the habit that had changed his life, not abandoning himself. Co-workers who once ignored him now listened. The younger ones saw a roadmap in him. The older ones saw a reminder of what they could still become. And Raymond realized that life hadn't rewarded him with luck. What changed was simple, raw, and transformative. He stopped being replaceable the day he stopped replacing himself with smaller versions of who he truly was. You don't control the fall. No one does. But you do control the day after. And that's what defines everything. Discipline isn't a spark. It isn't inspiration. It isn't some extraordinary burst of courage. It's the humble and powerful act of taking a step when no one's watching, of starting over when giving up would be so much easier, of deciding that your story isn't over. And if you want it to be, your restart begins before sunrise.